I want to introduce our next speaker, if that's all right. Our next speaker is Panama Bartholomy. He is the director of the Building Decarbonization Coalition. It's a multi-sector forum advocating for and creating solutions for our pollution-intensive building stock. We just shared some of those statistics with you. Previously, Panama was the European director of the Investor Confidence Project, where he worked to unlock capital markets for energy efficiency project development. Panama was the advisor on energy and natural resources to California Assembly Speaker John A. Perez. He has served as Deputy Director of the California Energy Commission's Efficiency and Renewables Division and served as an advisor for Chairwomen Douglas and Pfannenstiel. And he has also worked for the California Conservation Corps on vocational environmental education, and he also ran the Sustainable Schools program for the Division of the State Architect. Panama is a former board member of the U.S. Green Building Council, and he's past president of the Northern California chapter of the USGBC. He has worked on climate solutions in over 30 countries, presented at and collaborated on products from the United Nations, the International Energy Agency, and the European Commission. Panama is here to talk about the challenges and opportunities that come with decarbonizing our buildings. Panama, welcome to the Sustainability Symposium.
Great. Thank you, Mike. I appreciate that introduction that my mom wrote for us. And really happy to be here. I'm going to be talking about buildings and the great decarbonization of the building stock. And so I'll start my presentation now. So really happy to be here. Big fan of Greener Builder since the very beginning. Of the movement and the very beginning of the organization. You've done so much to really push the movement forward, and your audience is just a perfect one for the conversations that we're having on buildings right now. So I run an organization called the Building Decarbonization Coalition. I'll tell you about them in a second. And I was asked to come here to really give an update about where we're at on buildings in the building sector, what's happening out there on policy, what we're seeing is the impacts of that policy and some expected trends that'll be coming into the market as a result of that, as well as some potential different pathways that are being presented to us as we're making progress on building decarbonization. So that's what I'm here to talk about. I'm going to talk for about 40 minutes and have plenty of time for questions and answers after that. So the Building Decarbonization Coalition is a coalition of utilities, manufacturers of heating equipment, like space heating and water heating, the design and construction community, nonprofits and government agencies, all working together to try to eliminate pollution from buildings across the United States. We have a number of members who I think you'd probably be surprised at, but in particular, the manufacturers of heating equipment. We have within our membership manufacturers that represent 95% of North American market share for water heating and about 80% on HVAC. And the good news is that the supply chain is ready and willing to make this great conversion. But what we're missing really is policy alignment. We're missing the type of policy alignment that'll bring about the market changes that are going to be able to support this conversion. And so I'll be talking about that some today. When you're looking at buildings, really the emissions or the pollution coming from buildings, there's really three sources. You know, the electricity used in the building, and then tracing that pollution all the way back to its source, the power plant that produced that power, if that power plant produces any emissions. The gas use in the building directly on site for, say, space heating, water heating, cooking, or clothes drying. And then any kind of refrigerant releases that are coming from usually air conditioning systems, heat pump systems, heat pump water heaters, and the like. And so the good news is that on the electricity side, we're making some significant progress on cleaning up the grid across the United States. As we're seeing a wave of coal plants retire and be replaced by cleaner, but still not absolutely clean gas plants, and a significant push for renewable energy across the country. And this is a map that shows all of the states that have adopted renewable energy standards, meaning that they're requiring an increasing amount of electricity produced in their state and then consumed to come from renewable energy sources, we're seeing a much cleaner grid. And so all those electric appliances that are running in all of our homes and workplaces, they're getting electricity from a cleaner and cleaner source. So the good news is, at least that one of the three major areas where buildings are creating pollution, on the operational side, you're getting a much cleaner grid providing the power for it. Over on the side, though, of gas, it's not as clear of a picture. And what this chart shows you is where we consume gas in the United States right now. We basically consume gas in three different major sectors. We use it to generate electricity. We use it in our industrial practices, everything from food production to major manufacturing. And then we use it in buildings on the chart represented by residential and commercial. And so you can see that residential and commercial combined gas use in the United States, it's about 22, between 20 and 25% of overall demand for gas. So of all the gas used in the United States, buildings use about a quarter, a little under a quarter. So the thing about buildings is that even though buildings only represent about a quarter of all of the gas use in the country, it's 90% of the revenue for gas utilities. And so gas utilities have this role in the distribution of gas that they are the key point between the production of natural gas in our country and the distribution of that natural gas. The utilities distribute it to everybody, to the industrial facilities, to the power generation, and to buildings. But the way that utilities get money is utilities are basically infrastructure companies, and they get their money from building out infrastructure and then recovering rates to pay for that infrastructure at a really nice, maybe more than reasonable rate of return. And so to build that distribution system out to an individual power plant is very small. You only need one large pipe, but to build it out to an entire neighborhood, you're putting significant amount of pipe out in the ground. And so that's why that buildings only represent about a quarter of overall gas demand, but is 90% of the revenue for gas utilities. And so if you're going to really be striking at the heart of wanting to be moving away from gas, the building sector is the critical sector to focus on for cleaning up this pollution source from buildings. And unfortunately, we're not moving in the right direction. Right now, we have about one new customer is added to the gas network every single minute of every day in the United States. And what that means is that we're laying pipe in the ground that is going to be there for about 60 to 80 years. These are long-term investments of this life of this pipe. And that's not just 60 to 80 years of infrastructure, that's planned 60 to 80 years of financing that is being repaid by ratepayers over time. Now, many states that have climate goals have goals of, say, carbon neutrality by 2045 or 2050, just about 25 years from now. And so think about if you're trying to end the use of fossil fuels in the next 25 years, but you're putting infrastructure in the ground and requiring the financing of that infrastructure for the next 60 to 80 years, we're knowingly putting what are going to be future stranded assets in the ground and tying us to pay for an infrastructure that we're planning on not even using in the next 25 years. And so this is an example of we don't have the right policy alignment. We have policies that are encouraging us to continue to lay pipe for all of the buildings that we're building, but that's out of alignment with the policies around clean air and climate change. And unfortunately, we have a situation of some really old pipe in the United States, particularly on the West Coast, the East Coast, and in the South. We have a large decision coming up about whether or not we're going to go ahead and replace all of the old distribution pipe that needs replacement for safety reasons, or are we going to be going another path and really focusing on electrification? And there's an increased body of evidence that shows not only is the pipe largely old across the United States, but it's also very leaky. And ultimately, natural gas is methane, which methane is a super pollutant from a greenhouse gas perspective, which has a 85 times larger impact than carbon dioxide on climate change. And so as we have an old gas system that is increasingly releasing more and more unburned natural gas into the environment, it's becoming an increasingly larger problem for climate change. And so we have a decision coming up around the gas distribution network? And do we continue to invest in this as we build out new buildings and also replace that gas pipelines for the older buildings? Or do we start to go on a path of really focusing on electrification and winding those gas systems down? So moving from policy to politics, though, what you have is a lot of vested interest in the gas system. Not only gas utilities, but really gas workers. And in many of the states that have adopted strong climate laws, those are also states that really have a strong presence of union power in state legislatures. And so it's increasingly difficult for a union member or a union leadership to accept building decarbonization policies if all they see from that is significant job losses for their members. Less pipe in the ground means less workers to put that pipe in the ground, which means less union members. And so until we find a way to really show a future, a just transition for gas utility workers, it's going to be increasingly harder for us to be able to align policies around building decarbonization. And we'll never get beyond a niche of building decarbonization to the full scale that we need until we find a way to really craft a vision for how these workers have a role in the building decarbonized future. And make no mistake, they're going to fight it every way they can. In 2019, in 2020, we had a wave of cities adopting building decarbonization policies saying that all future buildings built within their jurisdiction would be all electric. In San Luis Obispo, a small coastal town in about central coast of California, in the first wave of these adoptions, the utility workers unions that provided gas to that community threatened to, this is at the height of the pandemic in 2020, threatened to bus in workers that would not respect any social distance to any city council meeting that was going to be considering a ban on gas in new buildings. And so from a perspective of the union workers, this is really life and death for their work and their union members, and they're going to treat it as such until we find a way to really work with them and make them be a part of it. And so that's all to say that, we all focus on buildings and builders, but ultimately the real fight here is around the actual gas system that provides the gas to those buildings. And increasingly, as we build more and more all electric buildings, we're going to have to be taking into account this legacy fossil fuel system that we've been connected to and the politics surrounding it. The good news is with all that clean electricity that's starting to come into states across the United States, you combine that with really highly efficient products like heat pumps and induction stoves, and you have a wonderful solution for significantly reducing greenhouse gas emissions and also air quality impacts from buildings. And the Rocky Mountain Institute did a big study in 2020, and they looked at the current grid of the United States, and they looked at each state, and they looked at where does each of those states get electricity from? How much of the electricity comes from hydroelectric, from nuclear power? How much comes from natural gas? How much comes from renewable energy? And then they looked at housing across that state, and based on the type of electricity coming in and the source of that electricity, they looked at what would be the impact of replacing water heating and space heating with heat pumps instead of doing that with gas water heaters or gas furnaces. And so the map that you see in front of you is a representation of just how much greenhouse gas emissions would be reduced by a switch from gas appliances over to heat pump appliances. The darker blue means you have a cleaner grid in those states, and therefore a very large reduction in greenhouse gas emissions as cleaner and cleaner electricity comes in to replace the gas used to heat water and space. The lighter blue represents still a significant savings, but not as much as the states with the cleaner grids. What this study showed is that in every state in the country right now, even the states with the dirtiest electricity, if you replace your water heater and your furnace that run on gas with a heat pump, you're going to save greenhouse gas emissions. As the grid gets cleaner and cleaner, this is only going to get better for states across the country. The good news is we're actually starting from a relatively good place, at least in the residential sector. This is a graph from the Census Bureau that shows all of the homes that have been built in the last century and a quarter. And it shows where they get their water heating fuel from. And so the blue represents the percentage of homes that have been built in the last century and a quarter. And I've highlighted the last 40 years, what sort of fuel they use to heat their water. And you can see that there's a majority of homes built in the last 40 years use electricity to heat their water. And it's similar for space heating as well. And so what you see is that we're starting from a good place of a lot of homes are running off of electricity, but unfortunately they're running off of really inefficient electricity. And we need to start to be looking at how do we take a bunch of these homes and buildings and start to run them off of highly efficient technologies like heat pumps. And so the way that we're going to do this, it's got to be a combination of policy reform and market development together. Ultimately, policymakers need to be able to believe that the market is going to be there to be able to support the policies that they're looking to adopt. But also the market is not going to move until there's some indication from policymakers about this is the way they're going. As of 2030X, we're no longer going to allow gas appliances to be sold. As of 2020X, we're no longer going to be allowed new buildings to be connected to the gas grid. Until there's those sorts of timelines set out, market actors aren't going to, besides the leaders, aren't going to be making significant changes in the way they do things. They'll continue on the status quo approach of how they can build their buildings and install their products. And so it's got to be both of these moving together in order to be able to make this work. And so what you see is a series of policies being pursued across the country from advocacy groups, looking for ways to reduce subsidies that are going to natural gas, such as having ratepayers pay for the extension of gas lines out to individual homes, taking away that subsidy, and instead trying to subsidize electrification. We're going to see a wave of new programs from the Inflation Reduction Act. Right now, we have electrification programs in a couple handfuls of states, and I would think that we're going to have them in about 30 states, at least 30 states, when you see next year when the Inflation Reduction Act fully rolls out. I'll talk in a second about building codes, and really new construction is the easiest place to start. You can design in electrification from the start. You can make sure that the products you're going to use are going to fit and that there's a needed electrical supply in order to be able to provide it. And then increasingly we're seeing states and local governments adopt appliance standards, saying that as of this certain date, we're no longer going to allow gas appliances to be sold within our jurisdiction. And then the big picture is really, how do you move from an appliance by appliance approach to a large scale planning of the gas system and the overall winding down of the gas system? And so these are the policy approaches that you're starting to see take place across the country. And right now, what you have is over 100 state and local governments have adopted a building decarbonization policy. Most of those policies are focused on new construction, with some focused on existing buildings. But what this represents now is that 1 in 5 Americans now lives in a jurisdiction that's adopted a building electrification policy. And we're starting to see that we're going to be having major cities in 2023 have a similar adoption. Chicago is coming up next. San Diego will follow soon after, and a wave of big cities really leading the charge to adopt policies that say, we're going to start by stopping the expansion of the gas system and then start to plan for the wind down of that gas system. And so you have 9 states right now and the District of Columbia that's actively focused on how do we start to constrain the gas system's growth and then start to plan for how we're going to be winding it down over time. And it's starting to have an impact in the market. Last year in 2022, for the first time ever, heat pumps outsold gas furnaces across the United States. This chart only shows central heat pump systems, does not show mini splits. And so if you had mini splits in here, it would even be a more significant gap between heat pumps and gas furnace sales. But we're starting to see the market really see where policymakers are going and start to respond. And I think what's interesting is the greatest amount of growth and the greatest level of installation of heat pumps across the country are in the southeast of the country. South Carolina, 45% of all homes use heat pumps. North Carolina, Georgia, Florida, Texas, heavy heat pump deployment states, as it has a limited gas distribution and low electricity prices in those territories. And so you're going to see this wave continue of states with climate policies really catching up and installing them for climate purposes, and other states really installing it because the market conditions lend themselves better to heat pumps than to gas equipment. Ultimately, the goal of advocates across the country that are working on building decarbonization is really to focus in on these states, focusing in on states that have strong climate laws and therefore have to be active in building decarbonization in order to help meet that. Collectively, these 12 to 15 states represent about 60% of overall gas demand in the country, and also represent about half of all appliance sales in the country. I think it'll be a long time before you see any federal government action on any kind of regulation for gas appliances. And I think what you're going to see is a lot of focus on state level action for a long time before you see federal action. And actually, it's a precursor to federal action on gas appliances and building decarbonization. We'll continue to see investment from the federal government, but I think regulation is going to be at the state and local level for likely the rest of this decade. On existing buildings, the opportunity that advocates have really been focused on has been on stock turnover. When does your water heater break? When does your boiler break? When does your gas furnace? When does your stove break? And you can see that based on this chart here, your average water heater has about a 10 to 15 year life, your average furnace about a 15-year life, your average gas stove about a 20 to 25 year life. And a lot of our policies and our programs right now are focused around how do you incentivize contractors and customers to be able to make different decisions when this happens in order to be able to give them money to be able to lower the cost of the electric alternative so that they can make a decision to put in the electric option, the high efficiency electric option at that point, rather than putting in another gas option. And so some states are now starting to take this a step further. The California Air Resources Board, the regulator of air quality and greenhouse gases in California, has adopted a policy that says that they're going to be adopting regulations that will require all water heating and space heating equipment for both commercial and residential sold in California starting in 2030 will need to be zero emission. Basically, the operations of water heating and space heating equipment that's sold in the state won't be able to put out any direct emissions. This basically will lead to a requirement of heat pumps or similar technology, non-emitting technology being sold for all buildings moving forward. The state of New York has also adopted, this is coming from the state of New York's building decarbonization roadmap, where they are they're proposing to require that starting in 2030, all water heating and space heating equipment sold in the state would have to be zero emission, 2030 for residential and low-rise buildings, and 2035 for high-rise buildings and commercial as well. Collectively, California and New York represent about 25% of all gas use in the country and about 20% of appliance sales. And so that's a significant market pull by itself. And what you're going to see by the end of this year is a number of other states joining in with California and New York on this timeline, so that there is collective momentum and market pressure coming from states altogether on this. And so I think you're going to see a lot of progress being made this year on these sorts of timelines. What I want to spend the last part of our conversation on, though, is the choice that we have before us in the building decarbonization movement. I've just laid out where we've been, and more lately, I've been thinking about separating this movement into really three distinct phases. The first phase has really been the 20 teens to now, where there has been low awareness of building decarbonization, no policies, no programs, limited supply of product, supply chain issues, some just because of the supply chain and some because of the impacts of the pandemic. And we're clearly have moved into the next phase of building decarbonization. We have programs and policies coming out all over the country. The Inflation Reduction Act could invest up to $80 billion into building electrification across the country. There's much higher awareness in the industry among policymakers and consumers. The Stovegate of January and February, all that attention on gas stoves and the fight over that was definitely a turning point in the movement. Good or bad, we'll see. And so we're clearly into this second phase, and it allows us to start to think of, is our current approach to building decarbonization one that meets our values and one that actually meets the path that we're going to have to take in order to be able to meet our clean air and climate goals? And so increasingly, we're thinking about that next phase of building decarbonization and what we need to do in order to be able to actually get to scale, a scale that's necessary to allow us to be able to meet our climate goals. Because right now, what you have is you have a building decarbonization movement being built off of the existing market activities of the water heating and space heating industry, the HVAC and plumbing industry, the current engineering industry, the current home building industry. And those industries are not as concerned, rightly so, no critique here. They're not as concerned about, are we meeting our climate targets? Are we meeting all of our values around equity? What are we doing about the workforce, both the current workforce and the workforce displaced by the move towards building decarbonization? How do our building decarbonization policies affect the rates that we're all going to be paying? The current market model of relying upon trying to tweak the HVAC and the plumbing industry and rely upon that is not going to be the type of approach that we need in order to meet any of our goals in those areas. Because what we're going to be seeing that if we rely on an unplanned model of building decarbonization, one of just waiting for appliances to fail and die, and then be able to try to encourage people to make a decision to go all electric, is you start to see a downward spiral of the gas system. Because as more and more areas adopt policies to require electrification, as more and more people exit the gas grid, you're going to have a reduction in gas demand across that gas grid. We have fixed costs associated with the infrastructure for the gas grid. The gas companies on our behalf are all putting infrastructure in the ground and getting financing and then charging us rates in order to be able to pay off that infrastructure. Those are fixed costs, and the less and less people on that infrastructure means the more that the people left on that infrastructure have to pay for it. That'll result in higher gas rates, and as we replace more gas, as we replace more of the gas pipelines, that'll also lead to higher gas rates, and that'll encourage electrification. As more and more people say, I'm not going to be paying these high gas rates, I can electrify, I hear I'm supposed to do it anyway. And you start to be able to see a cycle for the gas industry of reduced demand and a struggle to be able to pay off their financing and increasingly unhappy customers, similar to the surge in prices that we saw in January and February. And make no mistake about it, the gas companies are taking notice. This is a Wall Street Journal article from 2 weeks ago talking about, as electrification policies are passing across the country, you have legacy, long-standing gas utilities considering exiting the gas industry. This article focused on Dominion in the Midwest and National Grid which provides gas in the Northeast. And it talked about how each of them are considering ways to be able to, bring on minority or majority investors to be able to take the gas assets off their hands. Up in the Pacific Northwest, Puget Sound Energy, the largest gas distributor in the Seattle area, is sponsoring legislation this year in the Washington legislature about how to set up the framework for decommissioning the gas grid. The largest gas distributor trying to get ahead of the game here and dictate how the wind down of their gas system will take place. In California, the two largest gas utilities are working on a bill about how to start to wind down the gas system, and the Public Utilities Commission is working on that as well. And so the gas utilities are increasingly seeing the writing on the wall. I don't want to call the utility business model a Ponzi scheme, but it's a very similar approach where it relies upon unending growth and the assumption that you're going to continue to always expand the gas system, and you're going to always be replacing the gas system, and therefore there will always be new rates coming in at higher and higher levels to make that work. And if the financial community and the utilities cannot see 20 to 30 years out that that's going to be there, they're increasingly going to be looking to exit this field. And we all in the building sector are going to need to be able to adapt to this as well. And so increasingly, what we're going to be seeing is this focus on an appliance by appliance approach, creating real problems for the gas industry. The other issue with our current approach is one of a focus on stock turnover. I said before that this is the focus of the advocacy community and a lot of the policies that you're seeing, but waiting for every individual gas stove to break and trying to convince every individual to go ahead and put in an electric stove and an electric water heater and an electric space heater is going to take a long time. And you can't cut off any gas to a neighborhood until every single building owner in that neighborhood has agreed to get off of the gas system. In most states, there's laws called obligation to serve that require the monopoly utilities to provide all energy to the neighborhoods that they provide energy to until those building owners agree to not take that energy anymore. And so it is not a situation where a utility can cut off gas service to a neighborhood until everybody in that neighborhood actually agrees to give up gas service. And so you can think about the time that it will take in order to be able to transition whole neighborhoods off of the gas grid. And in that time, you need to be maintaining that gas grid. If you have leaks, if you have an old gas system and you have a neighborhood that's still demanding to use gas, that utility under current regulatory structures will be forced to go ahead and repair and replace that gas line, even though they know this is a bad investment for their company and for ratepayers moving forward, and they're putting stranded assets in the ground. And so we cannot wait for our climate goals for every single person's appliance to break over the next 25 years and hope that we're going to be able to convince everybody to go down this path. Because what that'll not only result in it's tough from a planning perspective, but it's incredibly expensive. Because think about it. If you're also maintaining this gas system and replacing this gas system and upgrading this gas system this whole time as you're building out the electricity system and also electrifying everybody, you're having to gold plate two energy systems out into the future. The chart that you see before you was some analysis done on California rates and looking at planned electrification, where you actually take whole neighborhoods off the grid at the same time and you're able to provide necessary electric infrastructure and you're winding down the gas system in a planned way versus unplanned. And what it would look like in 2050 and what gas rates would have to be charged if you were having a unplanned versus the planned system. And so the really large bar on this chart shows what would happen from an unplanned transition. An appliance by appliance approach is basically the utilities still having to have a full gas system, but only a few people on that gas system and all of them paying really high rates to stay on that gas system. For those of you that are builders in the audience or designers, this should be a very scary scenario about really providing buildings that are going to be a financial liability for customers that are going to be left on the gas system in the future if you have gas appliances installed in them. And so a much higher projection of gas rates for a few customers out into the future if you go ahead and do this in an unplanned way. Our current approach of appliance by appliance replacement too, it's not good for low income families. A lot of times when you're completely electrifying a home, you need to upgrade the electrical system. Electric panel upgrades can cost between $2,500 to $5,000 depending on the home. You need to run new wiring to be able to power these appliances, which are usually 240 volt appliances for heat pump water heaters and heat pumps. And that can be hard for a low income family. And when you look at a scenario of relying upon appliance by appliance, what you're doing is you're putting the costs of the transition on the building owners themselves. You're putting this big societal need of fighting climate change on the backs of building owners, and quite often building owners will pass it on to renters. And so for low income families, this can be a particular burden if, say, the panel upgrade costs more than the water heater itself. And so our current approach to building electrification on an appliance by appliance perspective is really hard to meet our equity goals. And then lastly, our current model in plumbing and water heating is really a race to the bottom. And when you look to buy your furnace, when you look to buy your water heater, I mean, all of us, we're looking for the cheapest option that'll provide us with all of the attributes we're looking for. And what that means is it leads to a market model of get in as many products a week as you can and move on to the next job as much as possible, and encourage us to bring in people that are really low wage and low technology into the workforce. And it doesn't meet our goals around really wanting to make sure that the next generation of the trades is going to be one that's well compensated with family sustaining wages and pension programs and protection for them out into the future. And so those are 4 major issues: ratepayers, climate timing, the workforce, and also equity that from our current approach to building electrification. And so what could it look like? And you're going to hear this a lot more out into the future. Targeted electrification, zonal electrification, zonal decarbonization. On the left side of your screen here, you have 2 different scenarios: an unplanned electrification, where you have electricity coming into a neighborhood represented on the yellow line, and gas coming into a neighborhood represented on by the blue lines. And on the left side, in the untargeted electrification, you have a scenario that I just laid out of not having good planning, and basically homes and neighborhoods, some have electrified, some still use gas, and you have to maintain that gas system completely for all those neighborhoods. Where on the right side, under targeted electrification, you're able to go in and completely electrify all of the buildings on that gas branch of the gas system, and be able to provide utility financing, no upfront cost to building owners to completely electrify the homes, panel upgrades, wiring, and that all goes on the rate base rather than an individual paying for that. You use good, well-skilled labor with pensions in order to be able to provide that. And you're able to plan it in such a way that it meets our climate targets, and you're winding down significant parts of the gas system as you're winding up the electrical system, saving ratepayers money as well. And so increasingly, you're going to be seeing a lot of conversations around targeted electrification and thermal energy networks as the future of building decarbonization. And this has been a long time goal of the energy efficiency community, but it's always been on a voluntary perspective. It's always been like, would you like to get energy efficiency upgrades on a neighborhood scale? And it's been really low participation. And the opportunity for building decarbonization is to really change that. And you're starting to see some of the first projects come out to be able to use this methodology. And so there's one right now in California, one of the California state universities, CSU Monterey Bay, was a former military base. It's on the central coast of California, a former military base. the military built a large gas pipeline out to the project. And that gas pipeline is coming up for replacement. And Pacific Gas and Electric, when the site was turned over from the military to the California State University system, Pacific Gas and Electric took over the gas distribution to this campus and the neighborhoods, about 650 residential units on it. And the gas pipeline's coming up for replacement. And so PG&E has done an analysis, and in the analysis, they've shown that it's actually going to be cheaper to go ahead and electrify all of those buildings on that gas network rather than replace the gas pipeline. Because in a lot of states, including California, it's around $4 to $8 million a mile to replace that gas pipeline. The crazy part is how much of that's just due to the trenching. But it's going to be cheaper to go ahead and electrify this entire campus rather than replace that gas pipeline. Not only cheaper for the utility, but cheaper for ratepayers. So all of us as ratepayers are going to be saving money if they electrify this rather than put in this gas pipeline. And so there's a proposal in front of the Public Utilities Commission right now to allow this project to move forward and use the money that would have been used on gas pipeline replacement to go ahead and electrify this. PG&E has done an analysis of their entire service territory, and they have hundreds of other projects, in their own words, that they've identified where they have a gas pipeline replacement coming up. And due to their analysis, they've found that it's going to be cheaper to go ahead and electrify neighborhoods rather than replace that gas pipeline. And now the question is, can the utility work with those neighborhoods to convince them to take all free appliances and to be able to clip off the gas grid and not pay for that stranded asset to put it in the ground? And so you're going to be seeing a lot of conversation over the coming years about this. And so if you look at a comparison about like planned versus unplanned electrification, it's pretty clear about the benefit that we need to be moving towards that path. But it's not going to be one that's going to be happening tomorrow or the next year. This is going to take a while. And so what I'm expecting to see really over the rest of this decade is increasingly we're calling the 2020s the messy decade. You know, we're in this period of mid-transition. We're both trying to exit the old energy source while we're bringing in this new energy source and this new approach. And so I think that we're going to see the continued focus of an appliance by appliance approach as we focus on deployment in the 2020s. How do we get as much product out as we can in the 2020s? How do we optimize the current market model and be able to get as many heat pumps and induction stoves and the technology out there? How do we raise awareness of this technology and making people really comfortable with it and wanting this technology as we're doing pilot programs on the zonal decarbonization and the targeted electrification? As we do in states across the country, we start to try out neighborhood by neighborhood. How can this look? What are the outreach methods? How do you do bulk purchasing like this? How do you bring together the contractor base to be able to plan out something like this? How do you coordinate the electrification of the neighborhood as you're cutting off the gas grid? We need to pilot all of these things so that by the end of the decade, when unfortunately climate change will probably be hitting us even harder, we're going to have more political will, and we'll have learned how to do this right, and we'll have a higher awareness and acceptance of the technology so that as we move into the next decade, we'll be able to do building decarbonization at a scale that meets our climate targets, at a scale that meets our values on equity, at a scale that provides good family sustaining wages, and at a scale that protects ratepayers in the future from the spikes of this global energy market of natural gas that we're now taking part in. And so that's why I'm incredibly encouraged about the future of building decarbonization. You all here are a major part of moving and catalyzing this movement forward through this second stage of the messy 20s into a stage of scale and growth into the 2030s. And so I'm encouraged by the progress that's being made. I'm encouraged by events like this where we can have discussions like this, and I look forward to any questions you have today and then working with you into the future. So thank you for your time and attention today.
Thank you, Panama. I really appreciate it. And we do have some questions for you with the remaining time. I wanted to get to a handful of them, depending upon how much we got here. One question we had from Craig, he wanted to know if you could speak to the issue of energy density relative to different energy sources?
Sure. So what I think Greg is talking about is, the sheer amount of energy that you have in things like oil or natural gas or say nuclear power, and that represents a significant opportunity to supply energy over, a small scale usage of say land. Or other resources. And like undoubtedly, you can get a lot of energy from fossil fuels and from nuclear power. I think what you're seeing though is a recognition on the fossil fuel side about some of the externalities, the air quality impacts, the extraction methods, and the pollution that comes from it, and then the impacts on climate change, and increasingly policymakers trying to address that through these policies. And so I'm not here to talk about, whether you believe in climate change or you should believe in climate change or should anything be done with climate change. What I'm here to report to you is that there are policymakers who are following this logic and implementing policies that are going to be affecting your industry. And whether or not you believe in it, if you operate in these states or in these localities, you're going to be affected by that. And my presentation is really giving you a heads up about those policies and the trends that are going to be be coming. But yes, absolutely, there's a lot of energy in fossil fuels.
Also had a question come in from Mary. She's saying that there's a federal court that just struck down Berkeley, California's natural gas ban. Is that an accurate statement there, Panama?
It's not quite accurate, and so let me explain. So Berkeley, California, in July of 2019 was the first city to put a policy in place that said no more new buildings would be able to be built with gas. The California Restaurant Association in 2020 filed a lawsuit against the city, claiming that its members were going to be injured by this policy. The lower court judge said that the California Restaurant Association did not have standing because it wasn't personally injured in this case. And the California Restaurant Association appealed that to the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. And on Monday of this week, the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals said, no, the California Restaurant Association does have standing as representing their members and potential injury to their members. And it also suggested that these three judges on this panel of the totality of the Ninth Circuit suggested that the way that Berkeley implemented their policy runs afoul of federal law and is actually preempted by federal energy law. And so what they did is they said, we recommend that this be kicked back, or we kick this back to the district court to go ahead with the court case moving forward. And so a few things on this. One, it didn't change anything on the ground. There was no court case settled. It kicked this back to district court, and that court case will now continue. Berkeley's, the California Restaurant Association sought an injunction back in 2020 against the law, and that was denied. And so current state of construction in Berkeley is you still cannot connect to the gas grid, regardless of what the Ninth Circuit said. Second thing, the Ninth Circuit focused on the particular way that Berkeley adopted their policy, using the health and safety aspects of their police powers in order to be able to adopt that. And the law that the Ninth Circuit quoted, EPCA is the acronym for this federal law that creates this preemption, has a specific carve out for energy codes. And if an energy code adopted at the local level can meet 7 criteria, it can be more stringent than the federal law. And so there's about 25 of the little over 100 communities across the United States that have adopted these local all-electric codes that use a similar path to Berkeley, and will now be facing some level of needing to go back and choose a different path to get to all-electric. The other 75 plus should all be safe based on the way that they adopted their code update. So this court case is going to continue at the district level. We'll see how it plays out. I do not imagine that it's going to stop local governments from moving forward using either the building code carve out of EPCA or relying upon air quality standards, similar to what the California Air Board, New York, State of New York, the Bay Area Air Quality Management District, they're all moving forward based off of emissions and not energy use, which is what the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals decision was on. So I still think you're going to see a number of government agencies moving forward based on greenhouse gas or air quality regulations as well. So it got a lot of press. Most of the headlines are wrong, and we're just going to have to wait to see how the courts play this out. I would expect that no matter what direction the lower court goes in, it will be appealed, and I expect that we'll see this in front of the Supreme Court in the years ahead. In short.
No, it's fine, because that kind of covered her question that she got to. So I'm going to move on to a different question, if you're okay with that. Iris asked, is the PG&E example of choosing to electrify rather than upgrade a gas main, is that a unique example because they provide both gas and electricity? And would the Public Utility Commission be the one to make the determination if there are two different energy providers?
It's a great question, Iris. So definitely easier, not easy, but easier if you're a dual fuel utility, meaning you provide both gas and electricity, to try to figure out the planning for something like this. Like, how do you wind down part of your gas network as you wind up your very own electric, and you far less coordination. What I think is interesting is we're in a very different place in, say, 2020 than we are here in 2023. 2 years ago, Southern California Gas Company, the largest gas utility in the United States by sales, released a new clean fuels report. And in that clean fuels report, they said that they expect that they need to electrify about half of all of the buildings within their service territory in order to help meet the state's greenhouse gas emissions, and that they're going to be increasingly focused on how to take about half those buildings off their gas network and really focus in on power generation, industrial uses that are hard to electrify, and then cleaning up the gas that they send out to the other half of the buildings they don't electrify. And so Southern California Gas Company, I think they would agree, they have been ardent opposition to electrification policies in the past, are now clearly recognizing the role that electrification has to play in this. And I think a large part of it has to do with the economic pressures that I mentioned, just the reality of owning an asset that has an 80-year life that's facing a 25-year shutoff notice, and the dangers of that for them from a business perspective. The Public Utilities Commission is going to have to be the one that makes the determination about everything on these sorts of projects. And there's a bill in the legislature this year, Senate Bill 527, that would give the direction to the Public Utilities Commission to set up a pilot program for this that would really outline how gas utilities would propose these projects to the Public Utilities Commission, and then the types of consideration the Public Utilities Commission would have to go through in order to be able to approve that. Is there adequate electricity to that neighborhood? Is this a cost savings to ratepayers? What kind of labor standards are involved in it? And so if this bill passes, it would be actually setting up a process at the Public Utilities Commission for how these types of projects would be considered and approved.
Question from Jim. Is it possible to transfer the old gas pipelines to just carry electric cable?
That's been talked about a lot, Jim. Electric cable, like what about maybe like fiber optics? And is this a way to be able to help with the digital divide in this country, to be able to put that through it? Could you run water, thermal energy networks about like running moderately warmed water to each building into a water to air or a water to water heat pump? You're going to see a lot of that, particularly in the northern Midwest and in the Northeast. Could you use it for that? And I think it's all comes down to the type of pipe that was used in each application and the condition of that pipe. My guess is, the utility business model is not one of like reduce, reuse, recycle. The utility business model is, replace, replace, replace. And so I would guess a preference would be, if they are going to do that, to at least use the right of way, but perhaps replace that pipe and find good reasons for why that pipe needs to be replaced. But I think there is an opportunity, and I think we're just going to have to explore it on a case-by-case model.
That makes sense. Paul wanted to know if you were aware of the Blue-Green Alliance, and if so, can you talk about what they've been able to do to build union support for sustainable development?
Yeah, absolutely. So, hopefully my remarks came off as kind of even-handed to the concerns of union members as they look at building decarbonization. And you saw that 2/3 of all the gas used in buildings are used in the residential sector, and you don't have a lot of organized labor working in the residential sector. And so for them, they look at this as purely like you're taking out pipe and you're replacing it with low wage, low tech workforce to put in a bunch of this electrification technologies. And that's a challenge for us. I think what you're seeing though, in particular in states that are already kind of ahead on these policies, is you're seeing union leadership see what's happening and start to respond. And so, Pacific Gas and Electric, the largest utility in the country, the IBEW, the electrical workers union there, they're responding, they're planning, they're thinking about what is the timeline for the wind down of their gas workers, because they represent the gas workers, and how do you transition a bunch of those over onto the electrical side as you wind up the need to expand the electric system and make sure that it's resilient. The plumbers and pipe fitters in Northern California have, in the Concord, in the Bay Area, have actually built a whole heat pump training center as part of their training center to train their members on how to install heat pumps, both commercial and residential heat pumps, and are looking for opportunities for how they can be involved increasingly in not only commercial, but residential as well. And so the Blue-Green Alliance has definitely been in conversations around some of the legislation that would lead towards more of a large scale, kind of a utility scale for decarbonization, because of the potential that it represents to be bringing higher skilled workers in to be able to make a lot of these installations. So very aware of them, and I think they're going to be playing a critical role in helping to transition a lot of these workers into still good paying, family sustaining with pension jobs in building decarbonization.
Very good. We're going to have to wrap it up there, Panama, but thank you so much for not just your presentation, but addressing the questions. Sorry to those questions and those questionnaires that we couldn't get to, but got a lot of positive comments, Panama, on your presentation, and thank you so much for sharing your time and your knowledge with us today.